welcome you all to learn about pollination. Flower is a fascinating organ of angiosperm and the site of sexual reproduction. Many of us believe the function of the flowers is to smell nice and look beautiful. Even after instruction, it is very hard to think of flowers as being responsible for generating seeds and fruits. Pollination is the first step in the seed making process. We will now learn about the process of pollination in this video. At the end of this video, we will be able to define pollination, distinguish the types of pollination, namely self-pollination and cross-pollination, and we will also understand the adaptation of both the types and enumerate the advantages and disadvantages of self-pollination and cross-pollination. You will also understand the different agencies for cross-pollination. I'll explain you how flowers are pollinated using the terms anther, stamen, pistil, stigma, and pollen. So let us now learn about the structure and parts of the flower first. Most of the flowers have 5 main parts: the pedicel, which is the stalk of the flower, and it holds the individual flower in place. The sepals, they are small leaf-like plants growing at the base of the petals, and they form the outermost whorl of the flower. Collectively, the sepals are known as calyx. The main function of the calyx is to protect the flower before it blooms, that is in bud stage. The petals, this layer lies just above the sepal layer, and they are often bright in color as their main function is to attract pollinators such as insects, butterflies, etc. to the flower. The petals are collectively known as corolla. The stamens, which are structurally divided into 2 parts. The anther, which is the head of the stamen and is responsible for producing the pollen, which is transferred to the pistil or female parts of the same or another flower to bring about fertilization. The filament, which is the part that is long and slender and attach the anther to the flower. These are the male parts of flower, and many stamens are collectively known as androecium. The pistil or the carpel, which is consisting of 3 parts. The stigma, which is found at the tip of the style, and it forms the head of the pistil. The stigma contains a sticky substance whose job is to catch the pollen grains from different pollinators or those dispersed through wind or water. The style, which is long, slender stalk that holds the stigma. The ovary, which form the base of the pistil or the carpel, and the ovary holds the ovule. Stigma, style, and the ovary make up the female part of the flower. With this fundamental knowledge about the different parts of flower, now let us learn about the pollination. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther, the flower parts that produces them, to the ovule-bearing organs. The pollen is deposited on the pistil's receptive surface, the stigma, of the same or different plant with or without the help of external agencies. Pollination may be natural or induced. The natural pollination consists of the transfer of pollen between the male and the female organs of the flowers without the intervention of the external agencies. When the external agencies help in transferring the pollen to the stigma, it is called induced pollination. Pollination can occur either within a flower or between flowers of the same plant or flowers of different plants. Depending on this, pollination is of two types, namely self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination involves the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of the same plant. You can see here in the first image, the pollen grain is transferred from the anther of the flower to the stigma of the same flower, which we call as autogamy. Auto means self, gamy means fusion. Autogamy, self-fusion. Or it may also be between this flower and another flower of the same plant, which we actually call it as geitonogamy. For example, wheat. And the second type is cross-pollination, which involves the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower. We can see here some agency is involved in transferring the pollen from the first flower to the stigma of the second flower, which is present in a different plant. We call it as allogamy, as it is seen in maize. So we have learned two types of pollination, namely self-pollination and cross-pollination. Here in this table, you can see the differences between self and cross-pollination. As we have already learned, self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma within the same flower, maybe the flower present in the same plant. Whereas the cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of flower, another flower present in different plant, allogamy. Self-pollination causes homogeneous condition, whereas cross-pollination causes heterogeneous condition. And it is like inbreeding, and cross-pollination is like outbreeding, because it transfers the anther to the flowers of the different plant. And the flowers produce limited amounts of pollen grains when is about to be self-pollinated. When the flowers are to be cross-pollinated, they produce very high amounts of pollen grains. And the self-pollination reduces the gene pool, whereas cross-pollination maintains the gene pool. And there is no need of pollinators in case of self-pollination, because it is just to transfer in the same plant or in the same flower. And the cross-pollination needs pollinators like animal or wind, which we are going to in the later section of this video. And this self-pollination requires only one parent, whereas cross-pollination requires two different parents. The process of self-pollination can be carried out when the flowers are even closed, whereas for cross-pollination, the flowers should be in open condition. And this self-pollination increases the genetic uniformity, whereas cross-pollination decreases the genetic uniformity. And here are some examples for the crops which are self-pollinated and the crops which are cross-pollinated. For example, wheat, rice, pea, orchids, barley, tomatoes, peaches, and apricot are few of the examples for self-pollinating crops. And maize, mulberry, pumpkin, strawberry, blackberries, grapes, plums, grasses are cross-pollinating flowers. Let us now learn the first type of pollination, the self-pollination, wherein we are going to learn about adaptation for self-pollination, the advantages and disadvantages of self-pollination. So there are two adaptations mainly for self-pollination. One is homogamy and the next is cleistogamy. Homogamy is the condition in which the flowers are bisexual, anther and the stigma mature at the same time, so there is greater chance of self-pollination, although that is not obligatory. Under such a condition, the stigma receives the pollen grains from the anther of the same flower by the agency of maybe wind, water, or insects. Example, sunflower, mirabilis, ixora, etc. Some homogeneous flowers, however, show special mechanism for self-pollination. Thus, in Mirabilis jalapa, when the stamens mature, the filaments recoil and bring the anthers near to the stigma so that when they burst, the self-pollination is achieved. The second adaptation for self-pollination is cleistogamy. In these cases, flowers never open. Cleistos means closed. In cleistogamous flowers, the flowers do not open at the time of fertilization. The pollens are shed within the closed flowers, so self-pollination is obligatory. Cleistogamy is seen in the underground flowers of Commelina, which are small and inconspicuous. Many rice varieties are also cleistogamous in the sense that the anthers in them shed their pollen and pollination is complete before the flowers open. So here are the list of advantages and disadvantages of self-pollination. So in self-pollination, the parental characters are preserved indefinitely. The flowers need not be too large. The fragrance and nectar's production is not at all required, and the pollen grains are not wasted, and self-pollination does not need any external agency. These are some of the advantages, whereas self-pollination also have some disadvantages. When the particular crop is continuously self-pollinated, it may lead to weakening of the offsprings, and the seeds produced will be in a poor quality. The defective character of plants cannot be eliminated, and it will not reveal any variability because it is continuously self-bred. It will not reveal any variability. So the next type of pollination is cross-pollination. We will now learn about the adaptations for cross-pollination, the advantages and disadvantages of cross-pollination. So cross-pollination involves the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower of different plant, which we actually call it as allogamy. This cross-pollination is accompanied with external agencies. Pollination between flowers of different genetic constitution is known as xenogamy. So the different adaptation for cross-pollination is unisexuality, dichogamy, heterostyly, ergogamy, and self-sterility. Dicliny is the presence of only one kind of reproductive whorl in a flower. So it is called as unisexuality. In dicliny, a plant may be monoecious, that is both male and the female flowers are born in the same plant, or it may be dioecious, that is male and the female flowers are born in different plants. Example, papaya and cucumber. The second adaptation for cross-pollination is dichogamy. It refers to maturation of sex organs at different time period. When stamens and carpels of a bisexual flower mature at different times, pollination between them becomes ineffective. Sometimes, however, it is found that self-pollination may take place at a later stage if cross-pollination fails. Dichogamy may be of two types. The first is protandry or protandrous, where the anther ripens or matures first, as in most Compositae, many Umbelliferae, Malvaceae, etc. As a result, when the anther bursts, it pollinates the stigma of other flowers, but not its own stigma, which is not yet mature or ripened. Second condition is protogyny, where the carpel of the stigma matures first, as in many members of Annonaceae and Magnoliaceae, as well as even in arum species. When the stigma is receptive, its own pollen is not ripe, so that it has to depend on foreign pollens. That condition where The stigma matures before the anthers, we call as protogyny, where the self-pollination is not at all possible.
As explained, dichogamy is the condition in which the male and the female reproductive organs of a flower mature at different times, thereby ensuring that self-pollination does not occur. You may observe protandry where the male reproductive organs, namely stamens of a flower, mature before the female ones, the carpels, thereby ensuring that self-pollination does not occur by the time the carpels are to receive pollen or when the stigma is receptive, the anthers of the flower dries up. Protogyny is the condition in which the female reproductive organs, the carpels of a flower, mature before the male ones, the stamens, thereby ensuring that the self-pollination does not occur. See for the maturation of the carpel while the stamen of a flower still in juvenile period.
So third type of adaptation for cross-pollination is heterogamy or heterostyly. This is the condition of occurrence of two or more than two types of flowers which have different length of style and stigma. That is why we call it heterostyly, different length of style and stigma. A familiar example is primrose. The primrose shows an interesting case of dimorphism, di to morphism, the morphology, two different morphology. In the first form, the anthers are placed deep down in the corolla tube and the stigma lies at the entrance. The pollen of this type are smaller and the stigma papillate and larger. In the second type, the anthers are placed at the entrance, just vice versa. Anthers are placed at the entrance while the stigma is deep down. Moreover, in this case, the pollens are larger and the stigma papillate is very smaller. It is much smaller.
Let us learn heterostyly in detail. The word we know hetero means different and heterostyly means different forms or different length of styles. Some plants produce two or three forms of flowers with respect to the length of stamen and the styles. Here, pollination occurs between the organs of the same length. Heterostyly is of two types, distyly and tristyly. Distyly has two forms of flowers and tristyly has three forms of flowers. Let us now understand distyly. This condition is seen in primula. It produces two forms of flowers. One is pin or long-styled with long stigmatic papillae and short stamens with small pollen grains. The other is thrumide or short-styled. We can see the length of the style here with a small stigmatic papillae. The stamens are long with large pollen grains. You may observe the stigma of pin flowers lie at the same level with the anthers of thrumide and the stigma of thrumide at the same level of anthers of pin, so that pollination occurs between these two flowers and not in the same flower. Let us now learn about tristyly, and this condition is seen in lithorum. As the term indicates, here the plants produces three types of flowers with respect to the length of the male and the female sex organs. As it is shown in the image, long-styled, normal-styled and short-styled. Long-styled has short and middle stamen, and the normal style will have long and short stamen, and the short styled flowers will have long and middle stamen. Pollination occurs between the sex organs of the same length. The flower with a long style gets pollinated with the flower with a long stamen. The flower with a normal style can be pollinated only with the flowers with a middle stamen, and the flowers with a short style can be pollinated by the flowers with a short stamen. So each flower gets pollinated by the other but not self-pollinated. and this is exclusively because of the variation in the length of the sex organs, and this condition is called heterostyly, which favors only cross-pollination.
Next type is herpogamy. Herpo means some barrier. So in certain flower, there may be some physical barrier between the anther and the style, so that pollination between them is rendered difficult or even impossible. In many cruciferae and caryophyllaceae, the stigma extends far beyond the stamen, so that the pollens from the latter are not likely to reach the former. The extrose anthers of Gloriosa disguise the anthers out of reach of its stigma. In Calotropis and Orchids, where the pollens are aggregated in pollinia, the pollination is entirely at the mercy of insects, leading to cross-pollination.
Let us learn hercogamy. In bisexual flowers, the essential organs, namely the stamens and the stigmas, are arranged in such a way that self-pollination becomes impossible. For example, in Gloriosa superba, as you see, the style is reflexed away from the stamens, and in hibiscus, you can just note that the stigma protrudes beyond the stamens, so pollen is deposited on the stigma before the bee reaches the anthers. This difference in spatial position between the stigma and the anthers reduces the chance that pollen from the same flower will be placed on the stigma of the same flower. Approach hercogamy is when the stigma protrudes beyond the stamens, and reverse hercogamy is when the anthers protrude beyond the stigma. In the approach hercogamy, the pollinator touches the stigma before it reaches the anthers, and in the reverse hercogamy, the pollinator touches the anthers before it reaches the stigma. So self-pollination is not at all possible.
The last adaptation for cross-pollination is self-sterility. As the term indicates, when the pollens are transferred to the stigma of the same flower, it becomes sterile, self-sterility. So this is a condition when a flower cannot be fertilized by the pollen of the same flower, or sometimes from a flower of the same strain of the plants. Pollen grains of a flower are incapable of completing growth on the stigma of the same flower due to mutual inhibition. Many species of solanum, like potato, tomato, and the tea plant, are self-sterile because of genetic reasons. In this case, cross-pollination is obligatory. Let us now learn about agencies for cross-pollination. Nearly 90% of wild flowering plants need pollinators like bees to transfer pollen for successful sexual reproduction. Birds, bats, bees, butterflies, beetles, and other small mammals that pollinate plants are responsible for bringing us 1 out of every 3 bites of our food. They also sustain our ecosystem and produce our natural resources by helping plants reproduce. Pollination, which takes place by the help of wind, is called as anemophily. Example, wheat and maize. Wind pollinated flowers are typically have no bright colors, and they will not have any special odor or nectar. They'll be very small, and mostly they have no petals, stamens and stigmas exposed to air currents, and they'll produce large amount of pollen. Pollens will be smooth, light, and easily airborne. Stigma will be very feathery to catch the pollen from the wind, and it may have staminate and pistillate flowers, maybe monoecious and dioecious, usually single-seeded fruits, for example, oak, grass, and some other papyrus, and all these plants are pollinated by wind. We call them as anemophilous. Pollination by water, we call it as hydrophily. In water pollination, The pollen grains are released either on the surface of the water or underwater and get drifted by the water current until and unless they come in contact with the stigma. The aquatic plants only undergo water pollination and they are called hydrophily. However, many aquatic plants with emerged flowers have other modes of pollination too. So there are two types of hydrophily. One is hypohydrophily and the other is epihydrophily. Hypohydrophily, when the pollen grains are released below, released below the surface of the water, then they sink down and get caught by the stigma of the female flower. Then they are called hypohydrophily. An example, seagrass. And the second type is above water, epihydrophily. When the pollen grains float on the surface of water and reach the stigma of the female flower, then it is called epihydrophily. Example, Vallisneria.
We will now watch how pollination in Vallisneria takes place. Pollination is epihydrophilous. We know it is a type of hydrophily which occurs on the surface of water. You may see the female flowers of Vallisneria have a very long pedicel reaching the surface of water. Male flowers are submerged and after breakage they float on the surface of water. Pollen grains are released onto the surface of water and are carried passively by water currents. Some of them eventually reach the female flowers and the stigma. Thus, pollination occurs in Vallisneria.
So here are certain characters of plants which are pollinated by water. They produce large number of pollens because most of them may get lost by the flow of water. And the stigmas are large and feathery to catch the pollen. The male flowers after maturation get detached from the plant and float above the water surface. The stalk of the pollinated flowers are usually very long to project the stigmas above the water surface. So here are some biotic agencies for cross-pollination. That is, pollination which takes place by means of animal. We call generally as zoophily. It is of different types. Maybe the biotic agencies may be insects, ant, birds, bat, snail, beetles, moth, bees, and butterflies. And they are technically called as entomophily, myrmecophily, ornithophily, and so on. So entomophily is pollination by means of insects. And entomophilous flowers are specially adapted to attract insects. Flowers are large, brightly colored, and have bright lines and spots on the petals. Small flowers may be aggregated in the form of inflorescence to become conspicuous. Flowers are usually centered to attract insects, and the flowers will have nectaries to produce and store nectar that provides food for insects, and pollen grains are large and sticky. So flowers with these adaptations are particular in pollinated by insects. The second type is myrmecophily. It refers to the pollination brought about by ants. Very good example for this is Medicago sativa. Ants, we know they are wingless and must crawl into each flower to reach their reward. Ants are most likely to take nectar without effectively cross-pollinating the flowers. Sometimes flowers supply nectaries outside the flowers to attract ants that keep other insects from stealing the nectar. It will force them to enter into the flower in a way that is more conducive to pollination. Next type is ornithophily, pollination that take place with the help of birds. Example, bombax. The flowers pollinated by birds are strong and are adapted to allow the birds to stay near the flowers without their wings getting entangled in them. The flowers are tubular and curved that facilitates nectar sucking. nectar sucking by birds. The flowers are odorless and brightly colored that attract the birds. The flowers produce large amount of nectar, and while sucking the nectar, the pollen grains are deposited on the beaks and the neck and is transferred to the a plant that they visit the next. Pollination is by batch. Pollination that take place with accompany from batch we call as Chiropterophily. Example, Anthocephalus kadamba. The flowers that are visited by bats are typically open at night and dull in color, pale or white in color, will be large in size and very fragrant, a fermenting or fruit-like odor, and they'll have copious dilute nectar and juices, and they produce large number of stamens. Usually, invertebrates such as honeybees and butterflies are responsible for pollinating a vast majority of flowering plants. However, invertebrates like snails also facilitate the process of pollination. Of the many animals which aid in pollination, snails are usually the last animals to be thought of pollinators. Pollination takes place by the support of snail we call malacophily. The flowers are malacophilous plants usually have a longer blooming period than most of the entomophilous class. Some of the common characters of these plants are that they are closely crowded and the stigmas and anthers do not protrude out. Example, arum lily. Pollination by beetle. Cantherophily is basically a type of cross-pollination of flowers done by beetles. And these beetles that feed on juicy tissue or on the pollen of the flower. The flowers are often large and centered, and the stamens are so positioned that the pollen is deposited on the insects while they feed on the nectar. Inflorescence pollinated by beetles tend to be flat with open corolla or small flowers clustered in a head with a multiple projecting anthers that shed pollen readily. The plants that are pollinated by moth, we know the moth are nocturnal butterflies. That is, they'll come only at the night time. These plants are called spignophilous or phalaenophilous plant. Moth-pollinated flowers, they tend to be much less colorful than others, usually pale purple, pink or white. They usually only open at night because we know the moths are nocturnal butterflies and they emit a strong sweet scent to attract the moths. The melitophily is the pollination carried out by bees. Bees travel from flower to flower collecting nectar, actually which will be converted later into honey, and in this process they pick the pollen grains. The bee collects the pollen by rubbing against the anthers and they're full of nectar. The flowers will be full of nectar and they are brightly colored with petals that are usually blue or yellow or a mixture of these two because we know the bees cannot see red color. So the flowers which are pollinated by bees will usually be blue or yellow or mixture of these. And they will be sweetly aromatic and they'll have a minty fragrance and they open only in the daytime. They provide landing platforms to the bee and often they are bilaterally symmetrical. These are certain characters of plants which are pollinated by bees. So pollination carried out by butterflies is called psychophily. And butterflies typically they visit flowers which are in clusters and provide landing platforms. They should be brightly colored, maybe red, yellow, or orange, and the flowers open during the day, and they'll have ample nectar in them, and with nectar deeply hidden, so that the proboscis will get deep into the flower to get the nectar at the time when the pollens will be transferred. So here are the advantages and disadvantages of cross-pollination. So we have learned what is cross-pollination, what are the different agencies that help in cross-pollination, both abiotic and biotic agencies. We call them as pollinators. And now we are to learn about the advantages and disadvantages. Uh, the advantages of cross-pollination is the useful characters can be introduced and undesirable characters can be eliminated. Whereas in self-pollination, we have seen undesirable characters cannot be eliminated because they are self-fed. Because here we get the transfer of pollen grains from one plant to the another, there is chance for the undesirable characters be eliminated. And it increases the adaptability of varieties towards the new environment. And the seeds which are produced after cross-pollination are usually large and they will be more vigorous. And the disadvantages, we know they depend on external organisms for pollination, maybe abiotic or abiotic agencies. And these are less economical, and some of very good characters of variety are likely to be spoiled. As we say, undesirable characters can be eliminated. Sometimes we may lose the desirable character also due to pollination. And the pollen grains are lost when, for example, cross pollination is the pollen grains are taken by wind current or water current or maybe butterflies or zoophilus animals. So during their transfer, most of the pollen grains will be lost without reaching the stigma of another class.
Hope this video would have helped you understand the process of pollination, the transfer of pollen grains from the stamens, the flower parts that produce them, to the ovule bearing organs or to the ovules. As a prerequisite for fertilization, pollination is essential to the production of fruit and seed crops and plays an important part in programs designed to improve plants by breeding. As sedentary organism, you'd have understood that plants usually must enlist the services of external agents for pollen transport. And we have learnt that in flowering plants, insects, birds, butterfly, mammals, wind and water help to transport the pollen grains. You might have also understood the adaptations found in the flowers for their mode of pollination in this video on pollination part 1. I'll be meeting you in pollination part 2 video on the special mechanism of pollination. Thank you.